we are in the world. You're very welcome to the State of the Science webinar, which is being run by the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre. We're based in the Manawatu, the lovely Manawatu, in the North Island of New Zealand, and we're really delighted that so many of you could join this webinar today. Today it's all about soil carbon, and we're really blessed to have two of the leading experts from New Zealand joining us today. First up, I'm going to introduce Dr. Peter Millard, who's from Manaki Whenua Land Care Research. Pete has kindly agreed to chair today's session, and he'll be helping to guide us all through today's webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to you, Pete, and welcome again to everyone.
Kia ora, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. Today we're going to hear from Professor Louis Schipper from the University of Waikato. Now, Louis is an environmental biogeochemist. He's got multiple research interests which include long-term changes in soil organic matter and nitrogen cycling, and particularly the interactions between the two. So without further ado, I'll introduce Louis and say, during his talk, if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function, type your question up, put it in as we go along, and at the end of Louis' talk, we'll get through as many of the questions as we can. So without further ado, Louis, over to you.
Thanks, Pete. I will just share the screen. Hopefully you can see that okay. Kia ora tātou, nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, ngā mana he ngā reo rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for that introduction, Pete. Much appreciated. So today I want to talk about looking at soil carbon, but also thinking about nitrous oxide emissions. And there's a long list of very valued colleagues listed here, both at Manaki Whenua Land Care Research and the University of Waikato. So just a brief outline of what I want to try and cover today. I'll certainly be focusing on soil carbon, but I'll be talking about a little bit about methane, but mainly on nitrous oxide as well, with a focus on management consequences of supplemental feeds and pasture renewal. And then moving on to a little bit of a look at diverse species and also plantain and sward. And on the way, before we get there, I want to talk about some methodological advances that we've made over the last few years between us that is allowing us now to look at more detail than ever at paddock scale and annual scale emissions of CO2, nitrous oxide and methane. So really should start with this slide here. Why should we think about soil carbon? I think many of us understand this inherently, but this is a nice piece of work done by John Sandeman back a few years, well, four or 5 years ago now, demonstrating that a large proportion of the extra CO2 that's in the atmosphere now has come from the way that we have used the land, and particularly crop and overgrazing around the world. And something like 20% of the extra CO2 in the atmosphere is coming from, or has come from, the way that we've managed the land. So this sort of demonstrates there's an opportunity to put it back, but it also demonstrates that it is quite possible to lose quite a lot, and we really want to protect the carbon that we have. And partly in response to this and many other questions that we have, we've established with Manaki Whenua a sampling system for the whole of New Zealand. This is being led by Manaki Whenua, where 100 sites per year are being sampled down to 60 centimetres or so for these broad land use classes. And they'll be resampled through time to see how carbon stocks change. And the really neat thing about this design is that it's going to be able to detect a change of about 2 tonnes per hectare within these land uses if that change occurs. But it's important to note that this is not designed to get at the impacts of management within these land uses. We might get some insight, but it's not designed to do that. And management matters. And management matters because when you look at the fundamental drivers of the increase of carbon in soil and the stabilisation of that carbon, you require photosynthesis and respiration. And a slight difference between photosynthesis and respiration will lead to either an accumulation or a loss of carbon through time. And photosynthesis and respiration are driven by these same primary drivers. And these, in turn, are driven by management practices, fertiliser, lime. But because they affect both photosynthesis and respiration, a lot of different things change when you do land management change, and it becomes very hard to determine from first principles whether soil carbon stocks will go up or down, and so it really needs measurement. So what's the approach that we use to get at these carbon balances, nitrous oxide and methane? We can certainly take soil cores and look at how carbon stocks change through time, and we do that, as you saw in the last slide. But the main way that I'm going to present to you today is an Eddy covariance technique, and there are sensors in here that are measuring the concentration of gas and wind speed and direction at 10 times a second. And what's really neat about these systems is you can leave them running literally for years. They require maintenance. But I think of them as looking out back over the pasture. So for every metre they are off the ground, they tend to look out about 100 metres and sum the exchange of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane. Now the carbon dioxide measurements are relatively routine. They've been done around the world for quite a few years now. The ability to now measure nitrous oxide in particular is a relatively recent advance, and that's what's in this big box here. And we've been pushing these forward both at the University of Waikato and at Manaki Whenua. A further thing that we have done is we found a way by which we can use a single tower, which is sitting at this black square here, to simultaneously but separately measure the exchange of those gases from two different paddocks. So if the wind is blowing from top of the screen, we're basically capturing the emissions from this paddock number 54 here. And if it's blowing from the bottom of the screen, we capture the emissions coming from paddock 53. And this allows us to directly compare how these two treatments emit greenhouse gases or take up CO2. And we can then compare different treatments, and I'll show you some examples of that a bit later. We also now, because we can do both nitrous oxide, methane and carbon dioxide, this allows us to look at total greenhouse gases rather than just considering one. And this is really important, and I hope to demonstrate that during this webinar, is that if you go from the left and you change this to some new management practice that might be targeted at trying to decrease nitrous oxide emissions, you may inadvertently increase or decrease CO2 emissions. And so this might look like a success, but when you look at the total greenhouse gas emissions, you might be running into some troublesome, unexpected consequences. So we need to consider all gases at the same time at paddock scale. We, working with Manaki Whenua, this is work that they lead, are modelling this system too to fill in the gaps and allow us to interrogate our information better and make predictions about maybe where we could go. And these graphs here are showing management and environmental impacts and plotting milk solids production. So that's just production with zero being there and a gain and a loss here. And the soil carbon change here, so more is better going upwards. And really where you want to try and get to is a system that is gaining both in terms of production, but also in terms of carbon stocks, but certainly isn't losing soil carbon, you know, in the perspective of this seminar. So we're combining these measurements with these modelling type approaches. So moving on to some of the work that we've been doing then, pasture renewal, supplemental feed. So pasture renewal is when pastures are not doing as well as the farmer might like, and they're looking to reinvigorate that sward. Often this involves a spray out and then a reseeding. and it can go through a supplemental feed, which I'll get to in more detail in a bit. But the challenge that we face when we go through pasture renewal like this is that there is a bare soil during the establishment phase, and that means that there's less photosynthetic, well, no photosynthetic inputs until the plant's established and start growing again, so no carbon inputs. Meanwhile, the microorganisms are fine. They keep degrading away and decreasing carbon stocks of those soils. Now, if you then also go through a supplemental feed, you're not returning above ground biomass into that soil, because you might harvest it. And you're also not getting the dung inputs from when animals graze that land and return carbon back through dung. So all of these things lead to a loss of carbon. And we've looked at this over a number of different studies, mitigation practices that we have trialed, and every time we've gone through a pasture renewal, we've recorded the amount of carbon that has been lost on the y-axis here. And this is on the x-axis here is the amount of carbon, the time between that soil remained bare. And basically what you can see is that the longer you leave the system, the more carbon that you lose. So that's not necessarily a good thing. However, working with our colleagues at Manaki Whenua, Lian Liang, and Mika Kirschbaum and Donna Giltrap, they modelled that if you had a reasonable rest period between these pasture renewals and got it back to pasture, you can probably recover the carbon that was lost during this pasture renewal event. So that's good. However, we have also then, because of our new approaches in terms of measuring all greenhouse gases, measured that during a renewal period, so this time along the bottom here, and this is nitrous oxide emissions here, that the new renewed paddock can still lose carbon. And this is about a third addition to the carbon losses that we observed when those soils were bare. And this, unlike the carbon losses, cannot be recovered. It's gone into the atmosphere, is going to go there. So we need to find ways to decrease the size of this nitrous oxide emission during this new renewal period. So then that's if you go grass to grass, and you can keep your bare period relatively short, and you won't lose too much carbon and you can recover it. But if you go through a supplemental feed, and the example that we've looked at, and there are other ones, is for maize silage, we have a bit of a different story. Maize, as one of our farmers told us, they grow it because it grows well at a time when nothing else wants to really grow, so that's a good thing. Produces a lot of dry matter. It's not a huge area in New Zealand, but there's a substantial amount of area that is under a wide range of different supplemental feeds. And because you're harvesting the above ground biomass and the soil remains bare, you can lose quite a lot of carbon. So what we've got here is some work that was led by Manaki Whenua, where soil samples were taken in long-term maize plots and adjacent pasture sites. And this is duration under maize on the x-axis here. And on the y-axis, we have the difference in the carbon stock between the pasture and the maize. And you can see that in the longer term, you get quite large losses of carbon from that soil when it's under continuous maize. And it's about 30 odd tonnes of carbon that is being lost in that maize. So that's quite large losses under continuous maize. But what about the sort of occasional maize crops that farmers might use during pasture renewal? And this is some work that we've done at one of our farms, Trouton Farm. And just to orientate you here, this is time down the bottom here, and this is the amount of carbon that's either going into or out of that system as a soil carbon stock. And anything above this line is a gain of carbon, and below this line is a loss of carbon. What we can see here is here's your first maize crop in the yellow, a little bit of effluent, manure carbon imports there, then the maize crop grows, and then it's harvested, and you lose that carbon from the system. You go through sort of an annual perhaps over the winter and plant another maize crop, and then you lose it again. Now at this stage we thought, right, we're going to put this into pasture, and we're hoping to see a recovery of that carbon in the soil. as indicated by that green arrow. That's a reasonable recovery rate. But unfortunately, what we have seen is in the longer term is that there's been this ongoing reduction in carbon at that site. And so we haven't seen the recovery that we were hoping for. We're trying to understand why this might be. So this is a large loss of carbon. It's equivalent to about 160 kilograms of nitrous oxide. And I say that because in some places we are thinking that maize with its low nitrogen content might decrease nitrous oxide emissions when it's fed out to animals because there's less nitrogen in the urine. And that certainly is true and may well reduce nitrous oxide emissions, but you need to reduce a great deal of nitrous oxide emissions to offset the carbon loss that you observe when you're producing the maize. So this is a sort of one of the first instances where we're starting to see trade-offs between the gases. So in the long term, it's really critical that we recover this carbon, but we need to figure out how long that's going to take. A further thing to think about maize, when you grow maize, you're growing it, say, in this block here, in the orange here, and it's being distributed to other parts of the farm or even to another farm. And so what might be happening here is a carbon loss, and we're pretty confident on that. But because you're bringing carbon into other parts of the system, you could get carbon gains in the rest of the farm or on other farms. And we need to figure out, this is a piece of work that we need to do, is how those trade-offs work. Can we do it in a way, particularly if we get carbon recovery at the old maize site where we first grew it, can we actually end up with a net carbon positive position? And that requires some thinking about. There are other alternative feeds and supplemental feeds. And so we need to look at these. These are just some examples there, and consider all gases to look at the trade-offs. Really, the question is, what is the best supplemental feed for the farmer and for the atmosphere? And I've heard it said that we're going to be potentially increasingly reliant on these feeds as we use it as an adaptation strategy to climate change. And others have also suggested to me that we might be doing more indoor feeding through time. So we need to know what is the best feed for the farmer and the atmosphere, and how do we manage those for the best. So that was supplemental feeds, the methodology and the supplemental feeds. I want to move on now to some work that we've been doing on plantain and diverse swards. Plantain, obviously, because people are interested in it from the perspective of nitrous oxide reductions. And so we've had a trial at the Troughton farm where we increased the amount of plantain here in paddock 54, and we compared the nitrous oxide and carbon balances of this paddock with increased nitrous oxide in it to increased plantain in it to one with increased ryegrass clover over time. And some work with by some of our colleagues at NZAGRC demonstrated at that site using the traditional chamber kind of study that when they had plantain at 60% of the sward, it had a lower emission factor for urine than just a ryegrass clover sward. So we had some confidence going into the study that the plantain should reduce nitrous oxide emissions. A couple of background slides about this trial then. Time along the bottom here, it's about 3 years. And this top graph here is the proportion of plantain that we managed to get into the sward. And this would prove to be incredibly challenging. Trying to get up to the target percent of 30% in the sward proved very difficult. And we really struggled to maintain it in there. Nevertheless, the production and the nitrogen inputs of both of those paddocks was the same, so we thought we were doing a reasonably fair comparison. And these are the results of the nitrous oxide emissions, again, time along the bottom here, and then cumulative, so this is the accumulative amount of nitrous oxide coming out of these two paddocks at hectare scales for both the ryegrass clover and the plantain rye and clover mix. And you can see that there is a small difference at the end of this time, about 0.9 of a kilogram of nitrous oxide, which you might go, well, that's great, plantain's doing something, but it didn't match the time when we had really good plantain and sward. So we didn't really find evidence in this trial that plantain was making a difference. However, it was really difficult to get the plantain up to the coverage or the percentage in the sward that we would have liked of 30%. We also did a carbon balance of these two. So what was the net effect on the amount of CO2? And interestingly here, the plantain rye clover mix lost, both sites lost carbon over this time period, likely due to weather, but events. It wasn't the greatest of years in the Waikato. But the plantain rye clover mix lost considerably more carbon than the ryegrass clover. So again, we've got this trade-off where we've reduced nitrous oxide, but we've increased the amount of CO2 that's ended up in the atmosphere by quite a lot. And then because of the methodologies we now have, we can actually add in the methane that was released from the soil, but also factor in the amount that came out of the animals, so from the ruminants. And you can see here the net, the total greenhouse gas emissions of these two treatments. And they sort of follow each other at the beginning, but then start to depart, and the plantain ryegrass clover mix ended up with an overall greater amount of greenhouse gas emissions. That was mainly driven by the change in the carbon balance. Moving then on down south to the work led by Manaki Whenua, where they did a similar kind of thing with a mixed sward that had Italian ryegrass and plantain in it as well, in comparison to a conventional sward. And these are their results. Same sort of axes, time along the bottom, cumulative nitrous oxide. And again, we see that the mix with plantain and Italian ryegrass in it had a lower nitrous oxide emission than the ryegrass clover by itself. And this is a substantial difference. This is a greater difference than we observed in the Waikato. So that's a good thing. When we then looked at what the carbon balance did, we saw a sort of a similar story as we saw at the Waikato, in that the ryegrass clover in this case here gained quite a lot of carbon, whereas the mixed sward that had ryegrass and Italian ryegrass and plantain in it basically stayed at steady state. And so this means that the mix relative to the ryegrass clover had lost carbon or had gained less carbon. I know this gets a bit messy, but effectively the mixed sward in a carbon balance hadn't done as well as the ryegrass clover. And when you combine it with the nitrous oxide emissions, you end up with a worse position relative to just your traditional ryegrass clover. So it is critical to look at all greenhouse gases. And so this really takes us back to the kind of modelling approach that we've done, is where in the past we did this in change of milk solids versus soil carbon change. But what we really need to try and get ourselves to is looking at the comparisons of production against total greenhouse gases, factoring in methane, nitrous oxide and carbon balance. And that is something that we are working on as a team. This is some of the first efforts that are being made to model the nitrous oxide fluxes within that same program that generated those graphs before, where the circles are the data and the line here is the first effort at modeling. Now, that, in places it looks really good and in other places it doesn't look so flash. But this is really hard to do. And I think that this is impressive because at an annual scale, you start to see that it's matching up reasonably well. And we've got work to do so that we can pick up the seasonal variation as well. And that's something that we're hoping to get on in the next couple of years. So some ideas about perhaps future directions. The top 3 bullet points there are ones that we're kind of working on at the moment and finishing off and getting all greenhouse gases involved. So supplemental feeds with the lowest footprint, thinking about diverse swards, including plantain, and then how we go about grazing management. Then some of the other ones that are really critical I think, that we're seeing in the international literature is how to reduce losses from organic soils, so peat soils that are drained. Enhanced rock weathering is one that's come up very recently, deep carbon placement, and thinking about trees in the landscape. These lists were supported by David Whitey. So just a couple of thoughts on this. Here's one on organic soils. We've done a bit of a back of the envelope calculation. Most of our peaty soils that are drained for agriculture are in the Waikato and in Southland, and they produce about 8% of our net greenhouse gas emissions at a national scale because they are degrading and producing CO2. And this will go on for hundreds of years until we do something about it. And the main thing that people seem to be exploring overseas is raising the water table, and that's what this graph shows here, is that as the water table climbs closer to the surface, you lose less carbon and potentially start to gain carbon. Now, how you manage that for an agricultural setting is another challenging issue. And so we've got polluter culture, which is where agriculture and restoration as an approach as well. Something we need to think about. Enhanced rock weathering. Now, interestingly, this is not about organic carbon and soil. This is about mineral carbon. And I'm just really learning about this, but as some rocks weather very finely ground, and as they start to break down, they can capture CO2. And this is the large geological carbon cycle. And most of the people overseas are looking at basalt, but dunite, which is a rock that we have in New Zealand, might even be better. And a very recent study that came out in Nature Geoscience was a modelling study, so it requires field trials. But it suggested that properly done in the UK, enhanced rock weathering could result in 50% of the required national required to get to net zero emissions. And Terry Eisen, a colleague of mine at the University of Waikato, is looking at this, and we need to consider the full production, mining through to putting on the land and capturing CO2 to make sure that we don't end up with unwanted trade-offs as well. Okay, just to wrap this up now. Renewal and supplemental feeds. If you're doing renewal from pasture to pasture and you keep your that length of bare soils relatively short and you get good establishment and then you don't do it too frequently, you're probably fine. You probably end up with recovery of the carbon that had been lost. If you go through a supplemental feed like maize, you can lose quite a lot of carbon on site. And that's because most of the carbon that maize is capturing is putting it above ground and not putting it as much below ground. You're not grazing it on site, so there's no dung returns. And so that carbon is not being returned. And then you've got these periods where ground is bare. So what can we think about in terms of solutions there? Keeping that cover to cover time short, maybe adding effluent manures like we showed at the Trouton Farm site and cover crops in between. And then we need to figure out how long we need to give them a rest and allow that carbon to recover. We need to think about the other supplemental feeds that are out there that really have not been properly explored much at all with the lowest greenhouse gas emissions. There's been some work on nitrous oxide, but the carbon balance of those systems is not well known, and we want to avoid unwanted trade-offs. We do need to think about all gases. We might have the best of intentions to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, but if we put something in place and we don't measure the carbon balance, we could be missing adverse effects that we're not looking for. And so we do see some evidence, preliminary evidence, that some diverse swards in Plantain can reduce nitrous oxide, but the jury's really out about what they do to the carbon balance. And we really need to figure out what is going on there. We have a methodology now developed. It's taken us a few years to get here, but this is, I think, at the cutting edge of what can be done. We can compare treatments at paddock scales, at annual scales, within real world farming systems, so we can kind of push the boundaries of what is possible and get answers that I think for me, I find just a little bit more believable. And we can apply this to other interventions like nitrification inhibitors, grazing timing, intensity feeds, and that sort of thing as well. So with that, I would like to acknowledge all the people that we've had a chance to work with over the years, including the authors at the beginning of this talk. They've been great colleagues to work with. It's been challenging. I want to thank the funders, the leadership of the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre, and these other funders here who have supported their colleagues in aligned projects as well. And then lastly, as always, I want to thank the farmers that we've worked with. They have given us insights and suggestions and improved the science that we have done. Kia ora tata. Thank you. Hey.
Thank you, Louis. So we'll now move over to the question and answer session. So I encourage you all to put your questions into the Q&A, please, and we'll deal with as many of them as we get time for in the next 25 minutes or so. I'm going to be feeding Louis the questions. If you put a question in the Q&A and it doesn't get answered in this session, we will do our utmost to get an answer after this webinar finishes. So there will be an opportunity to have a look at the questions and the answers, and also the recording of this webinar on the NZAGRC website, where it'll be available within a few days, we hope. So first question coming up, this is from Paul McGill, and he's wondering, does the nitrous oxide emissions vary between cultivator processes versus no tillage?
To be honest, I have not, we've not looked at that. I'm sure that there will be literature on chamber work that has potentially looked at the size of the nitrous oxide emissions. I suspect that the N2O that is coming from those systems is coming from the mineralization of the organic matter. And so if there was more carbon loss, it would probably scale with more nitrous oxide emissions, but I'm not an expert in that area and we haven't had an opportunity to measure that.
Okay.
Good question.
Thanks, Louis. So there's a couple of questions in the Q&A now around drought. So do you think that the ongoing loss of soil carbon after the 2 seasons of maize was in any way related to the droughts experienced in the Waikato?
That is something that is under active investigation. We have a paper being written up at the moment that is looking at the effects of management versus dry spells. It would not surprise me at all if there were more carbon losses associated with drought. And I think that the non-recovery of carbon in that maize site may be partly affected or determined by that drought. And when we talk to farmers in the region, they are certainly observing more frequent droughts than in the past. And so we will also need to be doing research on the climate effects on soil carbon stocks in New Zealand as well, so that we can predict the direction that we go into. Because while I didn't mention it in this talk, soil organic matter, soil carbon is also critical for soil quality. So sure, we want to keep CO2 out of the atmosphere or take it out of the atmosphere and put it into soil carbon, but not only for that, but for the health of the soil as well.
Okay, thanks, Louis. Next question. This is Frank Portuguese. Oh, sorry, no, let's just move. Yeah, here we go, from Frank Portuguese. How long is a reasonable rest period of permanent pasture needed to restore soil carbon? Assuming there isn't a drought, what would...
Right, so a reasonable, that is certainly, we could give you some better numbers on that with respect to the modelling that was done by Leanne. I'm taking it that you're talking about going from pasture back to pasture and not through a supplemental feed. And then I think somewhere at the 5 to 10 year mark, you're probably okay. A little bit longer would always be better. That would be, I'd need to double check on that number, but I think that's about right. Now, if you went through a maize, because remember that pasture to pasture, you're losing about 1 to 2 tonnes of carbon. But with those maize crops, you're potentially losing 6 to 12 tonnes of carbon, and that's going to take a lot longer to recover. Now, having said that, we're relying there on modelling to make sure that that carbon is recovered. And the lack of recovery in that under that maize crop surprises us. We would have thought it would have increased, but it hasn't. So if we're running into troubles with sort of climate effects already, then that could be challenging. So going through a supplemental feed, if supplemental feeds have the same carbon loss as maize, then we might need quite long periods of recovery, or we go to permanent, continuous maize and accept that one-off loss in smaller areas of the landscape for longer periods of time. And we need to do the math to figure out what is the least impactful on the environment and, of course, production.
Okay, thanks, Louis. Another interesting question here from Hayden Montgomery. What was the difference, if any, in methane emissions comparing your mixed sward, including plantain, with the conventional ryegrass and clover?
That's a really good question. So I need to back up a second. The idea that methane is being emitted from the soil, so just to be clear, this is not coming from the cows. The fact that methane comes out of the soil itself was unexpected and is something that we're observing quite a lot using eddy covariance techniques. It has also been observed using traditional chamber techniques, but probably I think it's fair to say it's underreported. We don't know why this is happening, and it deserves a study and an explanation. There was a difference between the two swards, between the ryegrass clover and the plantain, and I'm sorry I can't remember which way round that was. It was an important difference. It wasn't massive, but it was important. And it almost suggests that whatever is causing this methane emission, it's presumably coming from methanogenic bacteria somewhere, is under the influence, partial influence of management practice. And so we need to get to the base of that as well. But that is a very, very new kind of area to be exploring. So good question.
Thanks, Louis. Another interesting question here from Phil Schofield. Are you doing deep soil testing for carbon and nitrogen to verify the carbon balances you're measuring?
We have taken soil carbon core samples in the past. We haven't done it twice just to check that change. No, that is something that we have got planned to do. But most of our soil carbon sampling has been around these sort of paired site comparisons, and then also the national sales stuff, and that goes to 60 centimetres. It's a good point.
Okay, thank you. Another question here on those carbon losses from maize. This is from Lee Framp asking, would you expect to see a similar carbon loss as maize if it was ryegrass in a cut and carry operation?
That is something that we really want to look at. My gut feeling, until we look at this, is no. And the reason for that is that when you do cut and carry for ryegrass, you're really getting rapid growth again. So you're getting carbon inputs back into the system quite quickly. The other reason is that ryegrass puts more carbon below ground than maize, right? So maize kind of grows like crazy, puts everything above ground, and that's why we love to grow it, and doesn't worry too much about investing in roots. I mean, there are roots, obviously, but not as much as ryegrass clover. So the inputs of carbon below ground from ryegrass clover, even if it's cut and carried, are probably greater than maize. Now, whether the amount of soil carbon under a cut and carry pasture system is the same as a graze system is another question again, and is certainly something else that we are quite interested in looking at. I know that goat farms, for example, do cut and carry for health reasons, and that, you know, there, as I said before, people are thinking about more feeding indoors. And then there's also this question of occasional, you know, making of silage. And if you harvest that carbon as silage, as pasture silage, you're not necessarily getting the dung returns from if you had dung deposition on that paddock. So there is an argument to be made that you would have less carbon, but we really need to measure that because there's so many interacting factors. But yes, I believe that there is I reckon there are ways where you can grow supplemental feeds that have lower net effects on the atmosphere. Whether that's convenient for the farmer is another story.
Thanks for that, Louis. That was a great answer. I've got an anonymous question here. Are the plantain mixes and ryegrass pastures you showed for the greenhouse gas footprint for all established in the same way at the same time? Or is this a comparison between a permanent pasture versus establishing a new pasture with a plantain mix in it?
Yeah, good question, and that is important, and they are both paddocks were established at the same time.
Okay.
You're
cool.
using the same methods. Yeah. We have done it the other way in the past as well, but
so Paul McGill's asking, the trade-off between reduced methane emissions from diet, from forage rate and other greenhouse gases, N2O and CO2, will be a good trial to look at considering all greenhouse gases, perhaps?
Exactly, and I think we need to be looking at all of those kind of situations and getting the measurements of full greenhouse gases. I think one of the neat things that the people who are studying methane emissions from the Rumen have done is demonstrate that you can usually calculate the methane emissions from intake reasonably well. They've done a great job in kind of getting that. And so then if you can couple that either through measurements or a sort of modelling approach at a farm scale, that would then give you your net greenhouse gas emissions. Because in the end, I think, so it's really important that we remember what the target is here. The target here is to get greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere. There's policies and all that sort of stuff that are trying to encourage us to do that. But at the end of the day, that's our target, right? Not necessarily meeting whatever policy type structures are put in place, but actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And so we need all of these greenhouse gases to be accounted for when we look at how we manage the land. So
I'm just going to push you there a little bit, Louis, because we've got another question here from Hayden Montgomery. So if you're going to have to make trade-offs between methane, nitrous oxide and CO2, which gas should we try and reduce most?
That is a very tricky question. And it would basically come down to the size of those emissions. If you are making very small changes to nitrous oxide emissions, but the emissions of carbon dioxide were large, then don't fiddle with the nitrous oxide, get your CO2 stuff right. Now you need to do all of them. But it's not necessarily a straight trade-off of which gases you look at, but the size of the flux that you get. So we saw, for example, what we showed you there with the maize, which is a low nitrogen feed, that will, when you feed that out to animals, will likely reduce nitrous oxide emissions because there's lower N in the urine. But when we produce that maize, we put out a lot of CO2. So in that particular case, you've got to be mindful of the CO2 emissions because it sort of negates any benefit that you get from reducing nitrous oxide emissions. Yeah. So Hayden's question is a good one, but it's about the size of the fluxes.
Okay, thanks for that. Question here from Troy Baisden. It seems critical to get a handle on the relative above and below ground productivity, as well as end balance, including nitrogen fixation of the diverse swards versus ryegrass clover. Is there any data or work heading in that direction?
We've occasionally tried to look at that. The real challenge here, and it's absolutely right, the below ground biomass is critical. People tend to think about just measuring the mass of roots, which is important, right? So we know that, for example, there's less roots associated with something like maize than, say, ryegrass clover, and there'll be differences between different types of swards, mixed swards and diverse swards and all that. But what is also really critical is not the mass, but the turnover, right? And the amount of carbon that is coming out of the roots to support the microbial community in the soil. And so measuring the total mass of roots is one approach, but it misses a large amount of the carbon that's going into the soil that is probably being, is accelerating the turnover of the microorganisms and then leading to carbon storage. So getting a really good handle on what below ground dynamics is like is critical. It's really hard to do. And if you ever want to, you know, put somebody off and doing research, get them to do studies on roots, because it's a very challenging, heartbreaking kind of study to do, but it is really critical that we find ways to do that.
Okay, thanks. Now a couple of kind of methodological questions for you. First from Ben Woodward. What model are you using for nitrous oxide emissions?
So that is being done by Leanne Liane and Miko Kirschbaum, Donna Giltrap at Manaki Whenua. It's CenW, which is the model that they've been using for a while to look at carbon balances. And my understanding is that they're using some of the algorithms that were found in DNDC and incorporating them into their carbon model.
Okay, thanks. And another great question here. On a farm scale, how many of these Eddy covariance systems do we need to install? And what is the cost of installing one?
Great question. If you just want to do carbon, they're probably about 100K each. But you also need to know how much grass is grown. So it's not just a simple measure of looking at the CO2 exchange, but also the carbon that basically moves in and out of the farm in products or comes in as supplemental feeds. So these things are not, they're designed for research, right? Now, if you want to go to the full nitrous oxide, methane type stuff, you're now talking about a couple of 100,000 more than that. How many we need to put in? Well, it really depends on the number of questions that people have. I now know that people are starting to get into this in a big way. Ireland, I believe, is putting in like 30 towers. I know a colleague of mine in Australia, Peter Grace, and his colleagues are putting in, I think, nearly 20 towers or something like that. We have about 6 in the Waikato, and there's a few down in the South Island as well. They tend to require quite a lot of maintenance, so you've got to swap out gear, and so it's really good if you have some spare parts. But they're definitely, at the moment, a research tool. We have a number of people and ideas about how we might simplify those kind of measurements. It would weaken some of the interpretability of it, but not all of it. And so this is something that people around the world are shifting to.
Yeah, it's probably worth emphasizing that in addition to having the kit out there making the measurements, you've also got to have the capacity to process all the data and do all the sort of calculations on it. And that's
I'm very lucky as other people at Manaki Whenua to have some really excellent scientists in this space who can not only manage the farm systems but also handle all that. It's an enormous amount of data that you've got to be able to process and look after. You need great people.
Okay, thanks. Now I'm going to move on, slightly different topic, Louis. This is a question from Annette Liverland. And she's asking, is carbon loss driven by the C to N ratio in the soils? Maize has higher N levels in the soil, therefore microbes use more carbon?
I think it not in that kind of instance. I think the reason that you've got less carbon in those maize systems is because it is bare soil, and what's happening is that the microbes are active in the soil all the time. Whether it's a bit of a drought, okay, they'll slow down, but they'll still go, and so they're constantly degrading the carbon that's in the soil. And the reason that we reach a new steady state in soil is because the plants are constantly putting carbon in. And so when you have bare periods, the microbes are losing carbon. When you have plants that put less below ground and put more above ground, you lose more carbon. So the C to N ratio may well play a role in the carbon of that system, but it's, in my opinion, that's kind of a secondary to those other factors that I've just mentioned. Less carbon going below ground, less roots, and then the lack of return of manure into that system, which does kind of feed the soil microbes as well, and leads to some carbon stabilisation.
Okay, another question. This is from Alistair Mitherell. Are you planning to replicate the side-by-side paddock comparisons for greater statistical reliability?
That is something we would love to be able to do. And so what we tend to do, because these are expensive and challenging to do, is try and feed them through time into different studies that look at the same thing. So we have another study just on the go at the moment where we have taken pasture, ryegrass clover pasture. So this is a separate site. We put it through a maize crop, and now the side-by-side comparison that we're going to do there is plantain 100% versus ryegrass clover. So when we do that, we'll get another measurement of the losses associated with maize, and then we'll get another measurement of what plantain does. And so we are accumulating these studies. Within study replication, we basically have not had the resources to do it to that extent. At the moment, what we're trying to do is really get a handle on the size of the emissions. So we are building that up. And a good example of that is the size of the losses associated with the bare fallow period between growing material and growing material. We have accumulated through time enough measurements to continue to build that statistical confidence.
Okay, thanks. A good question here from Mike Beer. Compared to mixed swards, your carbon balance measurements show net carbon loss under ryegrass clover pasture. Is this expected in the longer term? Because it suggests we're continuing to lose carbon from our permanent pastures. And is this really true?
So that study that was in the South Island showed that the ryegrass clover accumulated carbon relative to the mixed sward. So I think it's actually the other way around, if I understood the question correctly. One of the things that we've done that I didn't have time to show here is that we have looked at all of the CO2 measurements that we've made for all of the sites and summed that up. Aaron Wall is going to be pulling that all together next year. And we published some of it in a recent Grasslands Journal article. And we've got something like 40 to 50 site years of data of pasture grasslands. And on average, they are basically at steady state. So they're not changing on average. And there'll be years when you lose carbon and there'll be years when you gain carbon. You need to make sure that when you're looking at those kind of measurements, that you are looking at the more steady state conditions rather than just immediately after maize or something like that when the system is kind of still readjusting. But so just to summarize, the 40 to 50 site years that we have of pasture would suggest that it is at steady state, and that supports the majority of the soil carbon resampling stuff that we have done as well.
Okay, thanks, Louis. Another question here from Annette Litherland. Are you planning on looking at multi-species, deep-rooted, etc., kind of grazing systems that regenerative farmers are following?
So we have looked at diverse pastures in a few studies. It becomes quite challenging to do. So what diversity do you look at, given that we have sort of limited resources with respect to the number of towers that we have? It is something that we are very interested in doing. And it's really about where it sits in the priority list, given the resources that are available to do those kind of studies. But certainly something that is of interest. And need to remember too that it isn't just about the biomass, it's about the carbon inputs that leaks out of the roots as well.
Okay, thanks. So we're pretty much drawn to a close. One last question. This is from Hayden Montgomery, and he's interested in your thoughts about calculating trade-offs using GWP 100 to compare gases, and whether that's the best approach, given that it underestimates warming impacts of some gases in the short term and overestimates them in the long term.
That's a question that's beyond me that would be the fast answer. But I think we need to be really careful here, right? We can get quite wound up about all of these different metrics for calculating greenhouse gases, and they help us prioritize, and that is absolutely critical. But let's not forget that we need to reduce our emissions. And it's no longer now, in my mind, a matter of sort of like, oh, well, you know, we'll only work on this one, we'll only work on that one. We know there are no silver bullets. We have to try and reduce all of these greenhouse gases. Now, it is about prioritization, there's no doubt. And we also, you know, we've been talking about agriculture here, but we also need to think about the way that we are using energy to get around as well. This is not about picking our favorite, you know, to go at it. It's certainly about prioritization. But we need to work on all of them.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Louis. I mean, some great answers there. So thank you very much for the talk and the Q&A session. What I've really taken out of your talk is how important it is to consider all those greenhouse gases and avoid those unintended consequences. I think you've given us some brilliant examples from the research which has been highlighting some things which on the surface might be a bit counterintuitive. So if we're only looking at part of the system, we miss something that's actually really important. So thank you for that. That was really powerful. That's great. So this presentation has been recorded. There will be a link provided on the NZAGRC website soon, certainly we hope within a week. I'd like to thank all the participants who've sat through and listened to this and put up with my sharing. I would ask that if any of you have feedback on the format of this session, please do get in touch with the NZAGRC, because we're always looking to improve how we run these. So thank you all very much. And with that, we will now close. Thank you. And goodbye.
Kia ora. Thank you, Pete.